Hi, I'm Stanley Goldberg, host of the Inquiring Mind podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you're new here, I release 2 episodes a week with a variety of fascinating guests, and I would appreciate if you would support my podcast by liking this video and subscribing down below. Thank you for your support, and now to today's guest. Jason Karlawish, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Oh, pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Stanley.
It's a real pleasure. I really enjoyed your book. I got this a while back, The Problem of Alzheimer's. It's a topic that is near and dear to my girlfriend, who has a grandfather who passed away from Alzheimer's, but it was not in my family. But still, that kind of got me on the path of trying to learn more about it and trying to understand it, because um, at the time that I first learned about it, I was very interested in the topic of cancer, because that's something that I dealt with in my family. So I kind of read a bunch of books about cancer, people's memoirs, people's Siddhartha Mukherjee's book, The Emperor of All Maladies. Kind of the popular texts. I'm not an expert on all things science and medicine, so I kind of wanted to
Yeah.
an accessible book about Alzheimer's, which maybe I didn't look hard enough. I couldn't find until I found yours, and
Oh, thank you.
it's it's probably the highest compliment I could pay as a non-expert in the field, is that it was highly readable, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. So before we kind of get into the book and all that, I wanted to ask you, what made you decide to write a book that's, again, like I just mentioned, kind of popular nonfiction, instead of making it a more technical book,
Academic book, yeah.
more academic book, and do you think that it has any utility in writing a popular book?
Well, I better because I didn't. But having said that, having said that, the I mean, the disease is so vast, large, stigmatized, and misunderstood that the physician in me, doctor means teacher, really felt there's a need to get a book that the interested non-professional reader can learn pretty much what what needs to be known to make sense of the disease. So I didn't want to write a book that was sort of how to live with the disease, how to care for someone. And some people who've read it have been disappointed. I read this book because I wanted to figure out how to take care of my parent, or and that's not what the book's about. The book though is about, why did this disease go from being kind of unknown essentially to becoming very prevalent to then being perceived as a crisis. And I thought that the story was important for people to know, because it's not an uncommon disease, and so therefore it's a big disease, meaning, and it's a public health problem. And so the American people, in summary, need to know about this disease. And so I humbly submit that my book was my best effort to educate the American public about a disease which needs their attention. Uh, every disease is awful, but this disease is particularly awful because it's so vast and all encompassing. And so I felt it was a responsibility to have a book that was accessible to just the sort of smart, accessible, non-professional reader. Yeah.
Was there something that kind of triggered that instinct, where you felt like, after something happened, I have to write a book that caters to a popular audience on this topic?
Uh, no, I can't think of a specific incident. I mean, the idea of writing, quote, a book about Alzheimer's was on my mind, no pun intended, for at least a decade. Um, I got busy with another book idea that prior to that, Open Wound, the novel that I wrote, and then I really turned to this book in earnest. And I think what really began to motivate me was to tell the story of the revolution that was occurring into how we understand the disease, because of using biomarker definitions. So it's no longer understood as a clinical diagnosis, meaning you have to be sick to be diagnosed. That's what a clinical diagnosis is. You've got to have some problem that you go to the doctor and say, I'm losing weight, I'm having fevers at night, whatever it may be. In the case of Alzheimer's, I'm having memory problems. That it's transforming from a clinical diagnosis to a biomarker diagnosis. I thought that was a very important story to tell, because it was part of a larger story in what was transforming in medicine, namely the definition of diseases based on biomarkers. But then the more I thought about it and worked on it, the more I saw there was these even larger stories about the disease. And so that really kind of got, I would say about 6 years ago, I really became enamored of doing that, telling the whole story of the disease. Arbitrarily, I kind of begin the story, although the book doesn't begin, but I begin the story in early 1900s. But, that was a decision. You could take this story back to the story of dementia from the ancient Roman times when the concept first came into to parlance, the word dementia. But anyway, in earnest, in the last 6 years, I really took the topic on. Yeah.
Was there a personal experience in your life where somebody in your family had Alzheimer's, and that's what kind of, again, no pun intended, had it in the back of your mind?
Well, I mean, why I went into Alzheimer's is the story first of why I went into geriatric medicine. I'm a geriatrician. I trained in geriatric medicine, which is a subspecialty within internal medicine. One of the fewest subscribed, by the way. They're geriatric medicines, despite the size of the adult elderly population. There are very few geriatricians. Anyway, I went into geriatric medicine because of a family experience, namely, and I talk about this in my book. I was at the University of Chicago, and I was training to become an intensive care physician. And I was matched in a fellowship program. And among a series of events, there were several, but one that finally tipped me to drop out of critical care and to move into geriatric medicine was the rapid death, the injury into death, decline unto death of my grandfather, who had dementia. And his story was very much a story of a time that still exists now, but I hope someday will become a historical time, which is he had dementia. We never got a clear diagnosis beyond that. Really no support at all from the medical community. A daughter who lived in town basically just took care of everything. Anyway, he fell, he broke his hip, a not uncommon complication in the lives of persons with dementia caused by Alzheimer's or other diseases. Broke his hip, goes to a top flight academic medical center, gets the best of surgical care with the best of techniques, and dies within 6 months, courtesy of all the complications that occurred, beginning with a delirium. And as that story unfolded, I came to realize, critical care is really important. And if one thing we've learned in the last 18 months is the importance of intensive care units, okay? But we didn't need more intensivists. It's a very well-subscribed field, but we definitely needed more people to figure out how to help families like mine and my grandfather. And so I switched to geriatric medicine. There were other reasons for the switch, but that really is what pushed me. I wonder if that hadn't happened to him, if I would have stayed in critical care. It's quite possible I might have. But that event really tipped me over. Yeah. And I talk
How,
about that in the book.
right. How long ago was that?
1995, 96.
And in your opinion, have we gotten better at either treating people with Alzheimer's or dementia, and have we gotten better at treating them or just taking care of them?
Well, in general, I think the trajectory has been improvement, but it's still uneven and incomplete. The work is not done, and depending on where you go, the work hasn't even started in America. So, back to my grandfather, I mean, he fell and broke his hip and got the best of surgical care. I mean, by 1996, America had worked out how to deliver surgical care. Okay, that worked that out decades prior, and Medicare was there to help pay for it generously. Inpatient. But what happened to him was he developed delirium. Well, at that time and even now in hospitals, steps are not taken to prevent delirium, which is an awful complication. Granted, at many hospitals, steps are now taken, and in the book I recount the work of Sharon Inouye, who was one of the pioneers in framing and naming the delirium problem and developing interventions. Um, when he was in the hospital, there was no coordination between the medical and surgical teams. I mean, he was kind of floating after surgery. Well, I chronicle in the book efforts to develop geriatric surgical teams that really unite the skills of surgery and geriatric medicine, anesthesia, and nursing to deliver care so that patients don't suffer postoperative complications and leave the hospital in the best shape possible. So those things are going on in America, but the problem is they're not as widespread and uniform as they could be. But I think there's no question that depending on where you go, care now is much better than it used to be. I truly think that that's the case. But again, you can go to places where care is just as bad as it was in 1996, unfortunately.
Right. And you just mentioned the fact that, in some places it's gotten a lot better, and in some places the process hasn't even started, and we haven't gotten much better since the
That's right.
1990s. Um, what can that be attributed to? Why have those places not gotten started?
Yeah, I mean, I think the overall problem of Alzheimer's disease,
Hmm.
uh, there are a couple reasons that are sort of explain why, and one of them that I talk about in the book, among several uh, that I think are top flight, is that the disease doesn't really have a good business model. And I know that sounds very kind of crass. What are you talking about? Disease having a business model? That's absurd. You're a physician, number one. And number two, diseases don't have business models. And they don't have business models. You could argue they shouldn't, frankly, normatively, not just descriptively. But in fact, in America, a disease doesn't fully exist until it has a business model. And what I mean by that is that within healthcare systems, okay, um, diseases need to be able to be paid for to be diagnosed and treated. Now, you say, well, no, wait a minute, not all, when you come about, well, some diseases that are rare and uncommon, you don't make money off of them as a healthcare system, but you don't lose money because they're not that common. And so, the workups may take a long time. The reimbursement for that workup isn't that generous. The treatments aren't that well
Mm.
reimbursed, but it's okay because you're earning money elsewhere to help pay for the physicians and other things that those patients need. But for Alzheimer's disease, because the problem is so big, the diagnostics, the time taken to do the diagnosis, et cetera, they're not very lucrative in our healthcare system. And so given that you have a big problem, you can lose money right away if you set up a memory center. It's not a money earning operation, even though it will be a very busy operation. And so it's a long-winded answer to say that, when a healthcare system thinks about what it does, it's thinking about the bottom line. And if they're doing a clinical operation that's losing money and losing money in a big way, unless they can find a way to cross-subsidize that, they're not going to do it, or they're going to vastly underfund it. And that's the problem that Alzheimer's faces. I mean, if you try to set up a memory center, if you try to set up a delirium reduction program, if you try to set up an adult activity program, these are not activities that earn money the same way a knee replacement program does, joint replacements, a cardiovascular program, an oncology program. Those earn money. They are earners. And they are lucrative if they're done well. And so until that's sorted out, you're going to have this uneven quality of care because, for example, I mean, we have a memory center where I practice at the University of Pennsylvania. I mean, I see patients there, but the problem is that hang on just a minute. The problem with the memory center is that it's not a money earner, but that's okay because we have a lot of cross subsidies from grant funding and philanthropy that make up the loss. So it works for us, but most hospitals don't have memory centers. And in the book, I recount the work of Dr. Peggy Knoll, who set up a memory center in Asheville, North Carolina, despite the fact that everyone told her, you're not going to be able to succeed. There's no money to be made there. But nevertheless, she persisted and she did it, courtesy of Medicare billing, charging the caregivers a separate fee for their support, and then philanthropy. But she told me, and it's great, and I say in the book, others who have come to try to copy what she's done invariably find themselves up against the accountants who say this is just isn't earning money and we can't sustain the resources you need to run this. So that's the problem that has haunted the field. Now, of course, other things as well have caused Alzheimer's to be a problem. You know, the challenges of diagnosing the disease because it's a brain disease and it's hard to penetrate the skull. Stigma, um, misunderstandings of nomenclature, changing nomenclature. But the business model one is certainly on that list as well.
I'm baffled because I don't understand why it doesn't make money. Doesn't the sheer scale of it, because the numbers you lay out in your book of the sheer amount of people that have this disease, either
Yeah.
Alzheimer's or dementia, shouldn't the scale kind of cover some of the costs, or just
Well,
because?
I mean, if you think about a patient workup, it takes about an hour. So it's a very history intensive, time intensive activity. You need someone to do some cognitive testing, staff person to do that. Um, so you've got an hour long workup, you've got extra staff, you need space to accommodate not just a patient, but their family. So literally your waiting room has to be a little, generous in its space. If you and those are the reimbursement for that new patient assessment is not very good, so you're not really going to cover your staff salary and your
But,
and your
but
rent.
why is the reimbursement not good?
That's what Medicare pays back. I mean, that's just a lot of the reimbursement that's done by Medicare comes from a very complicated, mysterious system uh, that is created by the relative values system. And the bottom line is it tends to better reward procedures,
Okay.
testing, um, etc., more so than time spent talking to a patient. I mean, there's efforts to pivot on that. It's about the complexity of the decision making, but you know, but this has been going. Medicare was put together in 1965, and it was very much designed to reimburse doctors to do what they did. And so, the more doctors did, the more they made. And one good way to do a lot of things is to do a lot of procedures and other kind of interventions. And so that's why procedure-based fields tended to flourish throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s in America because Medicare was generously reimbursing them, whereas a cognitive-based field just couldn't make a lot of money because that wasn't the way the reimbursement structure was set up through Medicare. And that especially matters for this disease, of course, because this is a disease where the most of the patients are Medicare beneficiaries.
Yeah. So what interests me is something you mentioned earlier in this conversation, is that you moved to geriatrics, which uh you said that there are not enough people going into geriatrics. And
That's right. Yeah.
c- can you explain, because I read a total of one book on geriatrics, I believe, and that's Atul Gawande's book, being mortal, I think
Yeah.
that's.
Hmm.
And he, for the first time, I learned about what geriatrics was and found it really fascinating.
Hmm.
And obviously, we do have an aging population that we do need geriatric care. But can you explain what geriatrics is and why is it so understaffed?
Well, geriatrics is another way of saying geriatric medicine, which is a field of healthcare, a field of medicine focused on the diagnosis, staging, and treatment of adults who have geriatric syndromes. And geriatric syndromes is a list of uh, 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 problems caused by diseases that affect older adults. So dementia, delirium, falls, hip fracture, deconditioning, to name a few, sensory loss, hearing loss. And so the field of geriatric medicine was it was created to train physicians who are uniquely skilled in the diagnosis and treatment of those problems. Um, Behind it being the science of gerontology. So gerontology is the science of aging. So namely, a geriatrician has done is equipped in understanding the science of the biology of aging, the physiology, pathophysiology of aging, the distinctions between aging and disease. So, in a nutshell, that's geriatric medicine. And the second part of your question is, so why are there so few people practicing that? And I know the standard sort of flabbergasted reaction people have is, well, there are so many older adults. It's one of the fastest growing populations in developed nations, persons over 65, particularly people over 80. Why is it there are so few geriatricians? And again, well, I think it comes back to things like um, status, stigmas surrounding aging, and also again a business model. I mean, geriatricians don't train to learn procedures and other interventions; they train to learn a way of thinking and problem solving and understanding a corpus of knowledge. And Many other fields in medicine where that's the case in the subspecialty, those are not well subscribed fields, like rheumatology, for example, would be another field that has a paucity of people going into it. But, you know, rheumatologic diseases are not as prevalent as aging is, although they're quite common with aging. And so, in summary, I think there's a host of sort of social, political, cultural things that have all worked together to make geriatrics fairly undersubscribed compared to the fields. I think there's also probably a kind of interesting, I'll call it epistemic point. Namely, to be a geriatrician, you have to be fairly tolerant of coping with uncertainty. You know, it's never, many factors are explaining a patient's problem. There's oftentimes not one disease at work. So there's oftentimes a lot of nuance and balancing there that occur. It also requires an interesting blend of being very interested in the biology and science, but also very interested in the patient's environment, social interactions, and relationships. Because, of course, aging unfolds not just as courtesy of biology, but aging is a consequence of how we interact with our environment over the course of a lifespan. How well we age is a function of our environment and the people around us. And so a geriatrician needs to kind of be in a very interesting blend of an interest in the biological as well as the social as well as the psychological. And it's hard to find a physician who's going to thread all those three interests together. So, put it all together and, it's not a surprise that it's an undersubscribed field compared to others in America.
Mhm. Um, do you see that? Do you see Alzheimer's as a microcosm of the overall problem in the medical field? Because I've spoken to uh, Dr. Azra Raza, author of The First Cell. She writes about cancer, prominent oncologist at Columbia University, and she she said that the way we treat cancer hasn't changed since like the 1980s. She calls it slash cut burn, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's radiation, surgery, and pretty much the person any advancement we've had in cancer, for example, is mostly due to lifestyle changes. So the amount of lung cancer people have has gone down because people stop smoking as much and stuff like that. So not really anything due to kind of medical advancements necessarily. And she focuses in her book on finding the first cell, that thus the name of the book, rather than trying to treat the disease. Dr. Leroy Hood, who I've spoken to, he also focuses a lot of his work on Alzheimer's. Also said that you have to focus on a more kind of preventative model, trying to find certain biomarkers and early on, and seeing if we can potentially reverse Alzheimer's, and if somebody's
Mm-hmm.
more predisposed to it. And he's devoted his life's work to doing just that.
Mm-hmm.
So, do you see Alzheimer's as kind of like a microcosm of the problems that we have in medicine?
Well, I think your theme here is for diseases that unfold slowly over time, inexorably, and are progressive. I think this is almost a both a scientific but also a normative argument to say they should be diagnosed as early as possible and intervened in as early as possible, if not even prevented from developing in the first place. Um, and and there's certainly a logic to that. I mean, who wants to wait until you're disabled to be diagnosed and then get treated? That's the approach that we took for much of the 20th century. Was you had to have dementia, meaning disabling cognitive impairments, in order to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And I think some of the reasons for that was you can't biopsy the brain like you can biopsy a swollen mass in a belly to see if it's cancer or not. But there are other reasons as well. So, I mean, I think even in the 70s, people were talking about the need to prevent the disease. I mean, Robert Katzman's essay that sort of launched the modern Alzheimer's field talked about it, that this is a disease that needs to be prevented. So the idea of prevention has been woven into the thinking about it. Um, but pursuant to your question, is it a microcosm of what's wrong? I think there's an interesting observation to be made there around, for 40 years, the risk of developing dementia has been declining in most developed nations. In other words, this is something that oftentimes flabbergasts people. What do you mean the risk of developing dementia has been declining? And what's been happening over the last 40 years is fewer people are developing dementia than we expected. There's still a lot of them because the chief risk factor is aging, and there are a lot of older adults, but there's just not as many people as we thought with dementia. And the answer there is in the ways we've lived our lives, namely better cardiovascular health, better education, um, uh, better social and economic opportunity, which of course correlates with quality of health. And so, that does expose kind of, I think, a flaw, never mind dementia, which is people who have better access and opportunity tend to have healthier lives, tend to live better. And so the inequities that you see in a society of wealth and poverty um, uh, uh, manifest themselves in problems like diseases like Alzheimer's disease. And so, in that sense, Alzheimer's, because it's so big as a problem, is kind of a microcosm of larger problems in America of inequities beginning in childhood in terms of access to quality education and continuing on from there in terms of access to quality healthcare, et cetera.
Um, to that point, I kind of want to build on top of it. I come across these articles very often that seem very clickbaity, where if you just switch to this diet, if you just do this, if you just do
Mm-hmm.
that, you have a chance of preventing A, B, or C, right? Like, and Alzheimer's is in that category, preventing Alzheimer's, preventing cancer, certain cancers or whatnot. I'm sure some of them have some basis in fact. The others just seem very clickbaity. Is there anything that people can potentially do in their day-to-day life
Yeah.
that could prevent Alzheimer's, or maybe reduce your risk of
Yeah,
having
as I
Alzheimer's?
say, science across multiple studies, well done large studies, has shown us that you can reduce your risk of developing dementia. And so what are those activities? I'll tell you in a minute, but before I do, remember the distinction here is the risk of developing dementia. And again, dementia is disabling cognitive impairment. So someone grew up and is cognitively unimpaired, does the things that she wants to do in her life without trouble. Dementia means, though, she's now developed changes in her cognition, declines in memory, attention, concentration, and those changes in cognition are causing disability. And by disability, I mean troubles doing activities. Now, most of us, when we think of disability, we think of physical disability, right? I injured my knees, I injured my spine. As a result of that, I can't walk, I can't climb the stairs, etc. Give me a wheelchair or a elevator or a ramp, and now I can move. I'm no longer disabled. Okay. With dementia, the disabilities are not physical, the disabilities are cognitive. So because of dementia, come evening time, I'm having a hard time organizing the recipe to cook the food. It's a simpler and simpler meal. Um, I would like to go to a restaurant, but I can't drive there because I get lost while driving. I get to the restaurant and I can't order off the menu because the menu is a visually confusing thing. I get my bill, I can't pay the bill because I can't calculate the tip. That's dementia. Okay. All right. The risk of developing dementia, as I say, has been declining over the last 40 years. That's well documented across multiple studies. What has not been documented is the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease as the cause of your dementia. Because Alzheimer's disease refers to a very specific disease that causes dementia, namely amyloid plaques and tau tangles causing neurons to die. And there are many other routes to developing dementia other than Alzheimer's disease. So all that was a very long-winded answer to say, I can say with confidence we can do things to reduce the risk of dementia. I'm less confident that those things are actually going after Alzheimer's, but rather probably other mechanisms that lead to dementia, like declines in brain neuron health. All right, so what are those things? That's a very long-winded answer, but the heart of your question was, what can I do now in my daily life to preserve my brain health? And I'll give the listeners a very simple answer, which is you go to the Global Council on Brain Health. So the Global Council on Brain Health, if you just Google that, Global Council on Brain Health, it'll be your top hit, and it's a council organized by AARP, which has assembled really expert guidance on what is known to maintain brain health, and what is known to not be so conducive to brain health. And they list out the pillars of brain health and the kind of activities. And I recommend listeners go to check that out. Now, spoiler alert, it's not a lot of secrets there. Good cardiovascular health, social engagement, good sleep, reduction of stress. Um, these are activities that have been associated with the preservation of brain health. Um, I think the motivator for people is to try and adopt those behaviors as opposed to just say they're going to do them. So anyway, Global Council on Brain Health, learn about the pillars of brain health, and these have been shown to translate into reducing one's risk of developing dementia.
Interesting. I will link the website on the bottom of my description of both
Yeah.
the video and the audio, so people could go visit that website. Um, in your book, you also mentioned the role of caretakers, and I find that very interesting.
We
Very
know we would
interesting.
call them caregivers.
Oh,
They're not
I
taking care; they're giving care. Yeah.
giving care. I apologize. Caregivers, and um, is that a recent change, or or has that been a
Yeah,
thought?
no, I mean, well, the history of caregiving is a very interesting history. So, so you're right. That once upon a time we used the word caretaker. It was not uncommon. And I think sometimes that word is still used, for example, for people whose job is to cultivate a garden, a physical garden, shrubs and flowers and things like that, and trees are often called the caretaker, or for a house where the owners are no longer there. Like, I'll take care of the house while you're not there.
Mhm.
It's more about sort of what you do for objects. You take care of objects. I mean, you could say the same thing of people, but many early in the history of caregiving, many objected to the idea of caretaker because they said, I'm not taking care, I'm giving care. And the word caretaker rapidly dropped. And you will rarely see the word caretaker used. But there is this word caregiver. And in the book, I talk about it. It's actually a very recent word. If you look at its history, just the history of the word caregiver, it doesn't really appear until the early 1980s in the English lexicon. Prior to that, the word occasionally appears, um, rarely, certainly not in context of a family member of someone with Alzheimer's disease. If it was used at all, it was used to sort of describe certain professional roles. Um, but then the word appears around the 1980s, early 1980s, and it takes off. And the reason why it appears is Alzheimer's disease, because as Alzheimer's disease got recognized in the early 1980s as a problem, and began to get rapidly recognized in the English language, you see this uptick a few years later that parallels the uptick in Alzheimer's of the word caregiver. Now, humans have been caring for humans since humans have been humans. I mean, the book of Ruth in the Bible, of the Old Testament Bible, Ruth, is the story of Ruth, who was a widow. Her husband died, and her mother-in-law's husband died as well, and Naomi. And Ruth becomes Naomi's caregiver. In other words, she takes care of her mother-in-law, who's old and frail. And that's what the book of Ruth is about. Now, nowhere in the book of Ruth is Ruth called Naomi's caregiver. She's simply a good uh, Aramaic, Hebraic daughter-in-law taking care of her elderly mother-in-law. And so then the question is, well, why is it that we call these people caregivers? They've always been doing it. Why are we calling out the role as a distinct role? And I think it's a very important question, and I think the answers are very revealing. Because if you don't recognize caregiving as a role that's distinct with a name, and then you can't count caregivers. You can't say, well, there's all these people with Alzheimer's disease and family are sort of taking care of them. How many family members are taking care of them? You know, and what's their experience? How much time does it take? How much does it cost? What do they give up to do it? What do they experience? And the only way you can answer those questions is if you start by naming the role, and by naming it, defining it, and by naming and defining it, creating a category. And once you have that category, you can begin to talk about the problem of Alzheimer's as not just the problem of the patients with the disease, but of the caregivers. And that's really what gives a lot of fuel to talking about the problem of Alzheimer's is, of course, the challenge of caregiving in America.
Right, and you mentioned in your book that their economic, you know, economic productivity that is lost because these people, caregivers, uh, kind of leave their jobs and take take this responsibility on full time, where they,
Exactly, exactly. Yeah.
yeah, take,
I mean, they're good family members doing what family members do, which is if family members in distress, I need to help them.
right.
But you're right. I mean, the problem is that the time and effort spent caregiving is time and effort spent not doing something else, like working or going on vacation or going to school. I mean, I have families where family members have either reduced their presence in the workforce or dropped out of the workforce in order to be a caregiver. Or if you're not doing that work, literally doing the work, and I mean work in terms of hours of time, you're paying someone else to do it. And so that's money that you're not using for something else, like paying a tuition or saving for retirement, or otherwise just buying things in the economy. And so it's that cost of the labor of caregiving that actually is the cost of Alzheimer's. So when people say Alzheimer's costs America some triple-digit billion-dollar figure, that's the typical number we arrive at, 250 billion a year. The majority of that cost of 250 billion is created by taking the time that someone spends caregiving, assigning a wage to that time,
Yeah.
and then calculating what they would be paid if they were paid to do that. And if you add that up across the 12 million caregivers, that's what gets you to the triple digit billion-dollar cost of the disease to America. So also, to frame it another way, Alzheimer's doesn't cost America 250 billion a year because of medical expenses for days spent in the hospital, testing, etc. It costs America that much money because you monetize the work of caregiving. And I think many caregivers, I think, find that a little bizarre because they're like, well, I'm just doing this because I have to do this. I'm like Ruth, I have to take care of my mother-in-law. And while that may be true, you have to see that productivity and economy is not just people doing labor in factories and offices, but it's people doing labor to take care of other people. And as a society that we haven't figured out how to value that.
Well, it's the same thing as a mother taking care of a newborn baby, right? Like they don't.
Well, it isn't. It isn't. I mean, she gets some time off from work. I think in this country it's rather pathetic, the amount of paid leave, but she gets paid leave. Her job is held for her, and then you're right. I mean, childcare in America is woefully undersupported. That recent stimulus package or the recent infrastructure package attempted to make that more accessible to Americans, but so far Congress can't see their way to pay for that. But at least there's an effort to create adult child daycare programs for children. Colleagues at work, I don't have children, but they take their children to a daycare program so they can go to work. They tell me the wait list for that is over 6 months. But so I'm not trying to say that the system in place for childcare in America is great. It's not, but it's much better than the system in place for elder care. I can tell you that.
Okay, so to that point, what can we do to assist caretakers? Sorry, I apologize, caregivers. What can we
Yeah.
do to assist
Well, we can do what
caregivers?
they've been asking for since they first began speaking up in the 1970s and early 1980s. It was caregivers, by the way, that formed the advocacy group that came to be known as the Alzheimer's Association. It was a group of families who were just disgusted with the quality of really the lack of care that they were finding for their relatives and for themselves. And since the formation of the Alzheimer's Association, one of their key advocacy points was the development of a system of long-term care services and supports for the American family. And their focus was, the vast middle class, the neither rich nor poor, who are left to fend on their own until they either bankrupt themselves or their relative dies, before they run out of money. And what they were advocating for was a system of long-term care services and supports, which most developed nations have, namely some degree of social insurance to support some of the basic expenses needed to provide care. We don't have that in this country. If you're wealthy, you just sort of pay for it out of your wealth, and it's a hit, but you manage. If you meet poverty thresholds, at a state level, you can get Medicaid to provide long-term care services to supports, but there's a wait list for those services. They're not entitlements. They're handed out based on availability each year. And then for the rest of us, you just figure it out on your own. You reduce your work hours, you pay someone else, you do a little bit of both, and you're kind of left to figure it out on your own. And that's still the state. That's the way it was in 1980 when the Alzheimer's Association got going, and that's the way it still is in 2021.
I'm interested to know when you deliver a diagnosis to a family,
Mhm.
or that the family member has Alzheimer's, or dementia, dementia caused by Alzheimer's. What do you say? What do you tell the family to prepare for? What do you tell patient to expect? And has that changed much in the last, let's call it, 10 years?
Well, I mean, I have a couple standard things I want to make sure that at a diagnostic visit are covered in principle and sort of conceptually is what I'm saying. And so so you're right, a clear statement of the diagnosis. Does this person have cognitive impairment? And if they do have cognitive impairment, is it disabling? Meaning, is it causing dementia, or is it causing inefficiencies in daily activities, namely mild cognitive impairment? I find myself less and less enamored of the need to say the word dementia as opposed to just focus on the disabilities. But I do like to make sure people get a sense of the stage that they're at. I mean, when people hear the word Alzheimer's, they often think, oh, in a year, I won't be able to recognize my family, bathe, dress, room, or feed, and I'll live in the community. I won't be able to do that. And I very much try to educate them about what stage they're at and, what to expect in the near future. So diagnosis, staging. And then another couple key themes I really want to emphasize in a diagnostic disclosure is the need to focus on what's a typical day. In other words, ask yourself that question. What is a typical day for me, the patient? And if you're the family member, what's a typical day for my relative with the diagnosis? And in asking that question, the answers should conclude that overall, I think the day is safe, social, and engaged. Safe, social, and it's engaged. But if the answer to that is, well, it's not very social, well, then what are we going to do to make it a little more social? If the answer is it's not very engaged with activities, it's 3 meals and television, that's about it. Well, what are some things we need to do to make it more engaged? If it's not very safe, well, why is it not safe? Well, he's still managing the investments, and he could make some terrible mistakes and we never know about it. All right, well, we have to cover that. That's unsafe. Okay. And so every family, of course, has to figure this out for the family and given their resources, their environment, their particularities of the patient. And part of the follow-up visits, and particularly with our social work team, is to do just that. Now let's take these principles that Dr. Karlawish has said. What's a typical day? Is it safe, social, and engaged? Ask and answer that of this patient and this family, and then put together a plan of care that's going to achieve those goals. So that's the general schema that organizes a diagnostic follow-up visit and sort of the steps that go on from there.
Yeah. So one more question before I get to my final two questions that I ask of every guest at the end of my podcast. If people want to learn more about Alzheimer's, besides the Global Council on Brain Health website that said that I would link on the bottom of my description, is there, besides your book that obviously people should read, uh, is there something are there resources out there that they can learn more about Alzheimer's, or books to read about Alzheimer's?
Yeah. So a couple of recommendations. First of all, the United States government has a website devoted to Alzheimer's, made for Americans. It's called alzheimers.gov. Alzheimers.gov. Great website, puts it all together. I think another great source of information on how to care for someone who has dementia is a book by Ann Basting called Creative Care. Ann Basting, Creative Care. I highly recommend that book. Um, I think that, people want to make sense of this disease culturally. and ethically. And there, I think we would want to turn to literature. And I think the stories of Alice Munro, the Canadian author, mostly a short story writer, one of probably the finest short story writers in the English language. Um, and Alice Munro, many of her stories are about aging, people who are aging, particularly women, though not exclusively. And I highly recommend the stories of Alice Munro. I think one in particular that I recommend is a story of hers called The Bear Came Over the Mountain. It's published in the New Yorker. I recommend though the book version of it because the New Yorker version is abridged a bit, and I think some key bits are missing. So Alice Munro's The Bear Came Over the Mountain in particular, I think is good to read. Um, and the Alzheimer's Association, the National Association, has a website that also is, I think, a very good summary of information as well.
Mm.
So those are, I think, some of the key resources that I would recommend. Yeah.
Right. So, two more questions to wrap this up. And I'm going to bundle them together. You can answer in whatever order you please. The
Okay.
first question is, if you have any, I hope you do, what gives you hope for the future? And the second question is more on the topic of books and information people can learn. What are 5 books, fiction or nonfiction, that you would recommend to people?
Okay. Well, I do have hope for the future because I think that the arc of history bends towards justice, as Dr. King said. I think we've had some bumps along the way, particularly recently, where we've gotten more, I think, frankly, tribal in our thinking, othering people. But I think in general, if you look at the arc of history, it's been one of giving people the opportunity to self-determine their lives, to be the people they are and want to become. And I think that fundamentally all people, adults, value that self-determination. They may differ wildly in what the values they hold to achieve that, but I think all adults value that. And I'm cautiously still an optimist that the arc of history is bending towards that the justice of allowing people to self-determine their lives, as opposed to be oppressed because they're of color or of a certain gender or sexuality or nationality, that they should be thought of as other. Although again, the rhetoric of the last few years has been rather divisive and tribalizing us again. But I'm cautiously optimistic when I look at the arc of history. Of books, well, let's see. Of late, I've read a book by the American author Lionel Shriver called "Should We Stay or Should We Go?" So it's a darkly comic novel about a couple that decides that they're going to end their lives when they turn 80 rather than suffer the indignities of aging. And then Shriver turns into a marvelous series of almost fables about the alternative histories that might befall this couple. I greatly enjoyed reading that. Um, uh, I, um, I confess that one of my favorite books that I go back and reread bits of a lot is a book by the French author Gustave Flaubert uh, called Sentimental Education. His book that he's known for is Madame Bovary, but I find Sentimental Education to be much better. Um, I'm one of probably the only few people who believe that. Edmund White, I think, though, does as well. The author Edmund White, he wrote a great essay about Flaubert where he really focused on sentimental education. I'm a big fan of that. Um, of other books, uh, uh, it's funny, we're right behind my shelves here, and uh, I've been reading a lot of Murakami, the Japanese author
Hmm.
Haruki Murakami, and enjoying his work. Um, I recently stumbled on Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage, and have greatly been enjoying that book. Um, uh, I'm thinking of books that I read that I used to enjoy a lot. I'm saying I don't enjoy them, but I've moved on from them. And I would say in that category, for a while, I was a big fan of Graham Greene's books. I'm not saying I'm not a fan of them, but I sort of moved on from those books. And so too with the books by Cormac McCarthy. For a while, I really was enamored of his writing. And I sort of have moved on from their books. I'm not saying they're not good. I've just sort of moved on from them, if you will. Um, and again, the fiction of Alice Munro, I find her stories in particular because she really tackles themes of aging, identity, the interaction between the individual and their culture, that says what they can or can't do. I find that those books very resonant, and I really admire and enjoy her short stories. So I'm not sure if it was 5 books. It was a bit of a ramble. It was also more
All
about
right.
authors in some sense than particular books. Um, but yeah, that's been the list that's in there. Let me just look around because on my stack here, yeah, it's just yeah, there we are.
I'm curious since you were reading Murakami. I read one of his books. I actually listened to it on Audible, where he talks about running. It might literally be called On Running or something like
Yeah,
that.
he's a big runner. He's a marathon runner.
Oh, what
Yeah,
I talk about when I talk about running, that's what it's called.
yeah.
But I found it really good. But I never know where to start with him. And if you have any recommendations with like a first proper
Yeah, I mean, Men
Murakami book.
Without Women. His book, Men Without Women. I have it right here. It's a short story collection. I find it. He's a very interesting writer. He'll sort of all of a sudden come at you with something. He sort of eases the reader along with a pretty kind of prosaic narrative, and all of a sudden just hits you from the side with an event that's like, where did that come from? But it's all just normalized as part of the way we live. I find that really quite enjoyable. There's another one, by the way, that I've read recently. I found this one. It's called Temptation by Jonas Kelly. And it's one of those fairly triple-decker long novels of a young man in Hungary growing up around the time of the early 20th century, Bela. And it's a Dickensian tale of a young man coming of age in Budapest. And I found it absolutely engaging. Temptation by Jonas Zekeli. Story of a young man, Bela, growing up, came from abject poverty and grew up. Um,
I'm a big fan of
yeah,
the New York Review of Books. They publish some good stuff. And
yeah. Actually, they've reprinted Zekeli,
yeah.
that book. It's a New
Yeah.
York Review of Book imprint. Yeah, I'm a big reader of NYRB too. I really like it. The other, by the way, monthly I like is the London Review of Books. I really have found that to be very engaging. I'm a kind of a big fan of the London Review of Books. So,
Yeah. Well, I'll check that out as well. Uh,
well, all right.
Jason Karlawish, it was a pleasure to have you on the podcast. The problem of Alzheimer's. Everyone should go out and get it.
Thank you
Thank you
very
for
much.
coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Stanley. It's great to be here. Take care. Bye bye.
Take care.